Everyone. Good evening. Again, my name is Shelley Inglis. I'm Executive Director of the Human Rights Center at the University of Dayton, and welcome to our almost last segment of this Elections 2020 series, which we've been putting on with the University of Dayton Law School over the course of the last 8 weeks. We've been exploring many aspects of civic engagement, participation in elections, and the issues that are facing us today with our democracy. We're very happy this evening to have an exciting panel and a keynote speaker who will join us soon. And I would like to hand it over to Andrew Strauss, the Dean of the Law School, for his introductory remarks.
Thank you, Shelley. I'd like to welcome you all to the 7th session of the 2020 virtual election series that's been organized by the Human Rights Center and the School of Law of the University of Dayton. The aim of this series is both to raise awareness and increase knowledge about what's at stake in the upcoming 2020 elections and to promote participation in our democratic process. This session today focuses on expectations, emergent issues, and breaking news as we enter into the final 10 days of the election. Please note that this is the final full session of the series and should cover issues that have not yet been addressed. The focus will be on the most recent developments, particularly social media and post-election threats and risks. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce Ohio's senior senator, Senator Sherrod Brown. Senator Brown truly needs really no introduction to this audience. He's one of the most familiar faces in the state of Ohio. And I have to say that as the Dean of the Law School, participating in these kind of events and being able to introduce such a fine public servant as Senator Brown really is one of the great joys of this job. So without any further ado, Senator Brown.
Thank you, Dean Strauss. And I had a little technical problem here, but I think we've worked it out. I switched from my iPhone to my iPad, and maybe that will work. But thank you. It's an honor to be back at UD. I was actually at UD, not at the law school, but at Bob Taft's class remotely just last week. And Governor Taft, some of you may know, was he and I have not always agreed on things. We actually ran against each other once. I was Secretary of State and 30 years ago, and he beat me for Secretary of State. So then he was Secretary of State for 8 years, and we came together this week actually to do a PSA encouraging particularly young people, law students, undergraduates, young people to work at the polls. When you voted in the past, you're aware that the average poll worker is closer to my age than to a law student's or an undergraduate's age, and a lot of people, probably asserting good judgment, have decided not to work at the polls this year, a lot of older people. And so Bob and I we've done a PSA and called on people to do that. So thanks, it's good to be back at UD. Professors Moke and Rhine, thank you, and Dean Strauss and Attorney Jacobs and Attorney Weiner, thank you. And for your public service, a number of you have been in and out of public service, but always done public service one way or the other. Since we're talking about voting, I'll be brief and I'll be simple and I'll be direct. If you haven't voted yet, do it now. Make a plan to vote. In Ohio, the laws are generally pretty good for voting, pretty open to voting, but in many ways they aren't. And I want to explore that. But you can vote early until the day before the election, to up through November 2nd. You can get an absentee ballot up until October 31st, but you must have it back in, must be postmarked by the day before the election. It will be counted. Ohio is a bit unusual on election night, not unusual, but for a swing state, indicative perhaps of what's happening. Ohio, unlike some other states, our votes will likely be 95, 96, 97% counted by 10 or 11 o'clock on election night. The boards of elections accept ballots postmarked the day before the election for several days after the election. That's a relatively small number. So while there is concern about Pennsylvania and some other states, the early votes aren't counted until after the election. In Ohio, the early votes are counted. They're opened ahead of time and counted on election night. So I just encourage you to work at the polls if you're willing and able, and certainly voting early makes the most sense. We've seen more people voting early this year by far than any election year in our history. But in spite of all that, Ohio is still a state where some politicians practice voter suppression. I'd start with the Secretary of State, the occupant of the office right now. He has gone to court to defend his decision to have only one drop box per county. That's one drop box in counties of over 1 million, like Hamilton and Franklin, or I'm sorry, not Hamilton, Franklin and Cuyahoga, counties that are close to 1 million, like Hamilton, counties that exceed 500,000, like the county many of you are in, not Professor Rhine in Clark County, but in Montgomery County, all just one drop box because the Secretary of State has ordered it that way. We also know that Ohio used to have something called the Golden Week, which was voter registration cut off the week after early voting started. So in other words, the first week of early voting was the last week of voter registration. So you could actually go into the Board of Elections during Golden Week and register and vote in the same visit. And unfortunately, the legislature took that away. We've seen President Trump has said, and I'm not going to this will not be about the presidential election, this speech, but President Trump once said that we don't want everybody to vote because if everybody votes, Republicans lose. I don't really believe that. I've been on the ballot and been running the election system and been an observer of the election system when big turnouts elect Republicans sometimes and small turnouts elect Democrats sometimes. But this year, we will see a huge number of people voting, and that's a good thing in spite of, and some people even think that because of these voter suppression efforts waged by politicians like Secretary LaRose and politicians like the President of the United States and the leaders in the Senate that we might have a larger turnout in reaction to that. It's really why my wife and I were lucky enough to accompany John Lewis 3 different times to the commemoration at the Selma Bridge, including the 50th anniversary of the attack on civil rights demonstrators in Selma, Alabama in 1965, leading to the Voting Rights Act. And John used to always say, make trouble, make good necessary trouble. John died this past year, as many of you know. If the Democrats win the Senate and Joe Biden is president, wins the presidency and the Democrats keep the House, I think the first bill you will see pass the Congress is the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, which will essentially overturn, I'm not a lawyer and I choose my legal terms carefully, but will essentially overturn the decision, the Shelby County decision that the Supreme Court made. And I would also say if Democrats win the Senate and win the White House, that the first things we will do, not just the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, but we will work to expand democracy. There has been a concerted effort by conservatives. Emerson once said that history is a battle between the innovators and the conservators. The conservators want to hold their privilege close. The innovators want to move the society forward, and the conservators in Emerson's day, the conservatives today have done much to try to mean fewer people will participate rather than more people. When I was Secretary of State, we did the opposite. When I was Secretary of State, we not only went out in the community to encourage people to vote. I enlisted McDonald's Corporation and Bob Evans restaurants to print voter registration forms on tray liners so that if you went to McDonald's or you went to Bob Evans, you could fill out a registration form and mail it to the board. And they tell me that probably not anymore because of computerization, of course, but that you would see at the Miami County or the Montgomery County or the Clark County Board of Elections, you'd see registration forms with ketchup and mustard stains, but they count nonetheless. That's how easy we wanted to make it to vote. We have seen politicians now that don't believe in that, often aimed at race, often aimed at young people, the groups of people that are the least likely to vote. That's what we should be doing today. We don't do it. I would close with just one request and one small observation, but an important one, I hope. I ask each of you that care about this. I know that both the head of the college Republicans and the law school Republicans and the law school Democrats are in this call. I appreciate that they're both on. I encourage all of you as activists, people that care enough to be involved in this human rights series like this, to go out and find 5 people who might not vote if you don't talk to them. I mean, keep in mind that it's a relatively small number of people that get as involved as you're all getting as law students and as faculty, and care so much about elections and care about the direction of the country. I'd ask you to each go out and get 5 people who are less interested in you than you are. Might be a relative, might be somebody from school or work or church, and encourage and sit with them remotely or personally, sit with them and help them make a plan to vote, and encourage them, of course, to vote early. Last thing I wanted to say is Senator Doug Jones and I is a pretty good friend of mine from Alabama, and he organized a group of 5 senators to go to the Senate floor this past summer to read Dr. King's letter from the Birmingham jail. And I think I would assume many of you have studied that letter. Dr. King was a bit impatient, more than a bit, with quote unquote moderate white ministers of Montgomery and Birmingham and Selma and all over the state and all over the South, that they didn't see the urgency of moving more quickly on voting rights. And this was this was 1963. It took another 2 years till Congress really did what Congress should have done a long time before that. But Senator Jones asked me and 4 or 5 other senators to join him on the Senate floor and read the letter from the Birmingham jail. And he let me read my favorite part of that letter. And my favorite part of that letter is my favorite Dr. King quote, where Dr. King said, "Progress never rolls in on the wheels of inevitability. Progress never rolls in on the wheels of inevitability." And to move this country forward, to do what we need to do, takes the activism of so many of you to follow the admonition of Dr. King and to follow the admonition of John Lewis to make trouble, make good necessary trouble. So thanks for having me. Enjoy the panel with Professors Rhine and Moke and with attorneys Jacobs and Weiner. And I appreciate very much getting to speak at this event in Dayton. Thanks so much. There, you're back.
It is now my pleasure to introduce our panel.
So I'm going to take over for a moment and thank Sherrod Brown for his speech and express our appreciation. I know you didn't have time to take questions. We did have one come in, and so I'm just going to mention it did come in through the question and answer, and it was, what do you suggest be done by people should the election turn to a second Trump administration, advocates of human rights and deepening our democracy? What should be done?
What should be done if Trump wins? Is that the question?
That was the question that came through the Q&A.
Well, I must admit, I don't think much about that. I just know that he's not going to. I think the Democrats are going to win. Biden's going to win Ohio because I just think Biden is the most pro-worker candidate in a generation, and Trump has betrayed workers, and that doesn't work in Ohio. So if I'm wrong about that, ask me that question then, but I don't put a lot of energy into thinking about that. I do think a lot about the damage this president could do in the next 4 years. So I'll just leave it at that. All right.
Thanks so much for fielding the question.
Sure.
And you're welcome to stay with us as long as you can. I'm gonna hand the microphone over to our moderator, Mally Cantris, who is an adjunct professor at the School of Law at the University of Dayton. Mally, the floor is yours.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm so glad to see so many people on the webinar. I have the pleasure of introducing each of our panelists. First up, we have Jonathan Weiner, who provides strategic counsel and solutions for domestic and international clients faced with complex cross-border compliance and enforcement issues. He plays a leading role in the Keep Our Republic movement, which is dedicated to preventing and highlighting extraordinary threats to the 2020 elections and transition. Before I hand the mic and video over to you, just want to remind you all that if you have questions while each person is speaking, you may drop them in the Q&A section of your screen, and we will try to get to them when each panelist is finished with their particular area of speech. Over to you.
Hi, so I've had the privilege since the early 1980s when I was counsel for Senator John Kerry to work on election law at the federal level. I've never seen anything like 2020 and the kinds of issues that we all could be facing. And the organization that I've been part of with Senator Gary Hart and former Governor and Homeland Security head Tom Ridge and former Senator Tim Wirth and former Democratic leader Richard Gephardt, among others, has been focused on trying to vindicate three principles, which we think are principles that make sense for absolutely everybody, regardless of your political party, what part of the country you live in, what you want to see happen, because they're fundamental human rights. And the fundamental human right is everybody getting a chance to vote. Now, this has been made really hard this year by COVID, post office delays, and limits on drop boxes. But to the extent that we're talking about voting as a right, it seems to me that we all will be talking about just make it possible for everybody to vote. And state law should be doing that. State legislators and state laws and state officials, everybody should be going that direction and talking about that as a basic principle. Now, the second thing that you ordinarily wouldn't have to think about, but this year you have to think about, is the counting of the vote. Because of COVID, everything is much harder. And this year we've got the risk of all kinds of litigation and the possibility, because people are so divided, of civic unrest. And if you wind up with civic unrest, some crazy situation developing in Ohio, of the kind that we saw develop in Portland, for example, or develop in Kenosha, Wisconsin, for example, or in Washington's Lafayette Square, and you wound up with people facing off with one another, you could imagine the disruption of the vote. In addition, we've got Iranian meddling, Iranian efforts to interfere with the election, send disinformation, possible Russian efforts at disinformation. We've looked at scenarios where people could even hack into our electrical system and shut down voting. And so that then gets into not just the voting, but the counting of the vote. And it's critical that the votes all get counted all the way to the end. And then it's going to be critical that those votes that get counted get certified, so that in every state we see the counting get completed and then agreement on the certification. And the process is different from state to state. Most states, it's Secretary of State. In a few states, Wisconsin's an example, there's actually an elections commission that can split and even deadlock on who's won the vote. So the nightmare scenarios that we've been looking at for Keep Our Republic, which we don't want Ohio to see any of, is what happens if you wind up with a situation where there's uncertainty about whether votes are real or not. You get questions about fraudulent votes. If people start fighting with one another and prevent people from voting, if you have litigation of the votes that stops the voting or stops the counting or stops the certification. And in that situation, you can wind up with nightmares, which include the situation where the 12th Amendment and the Electoral Count Act, which was passed after election in the 19th century, got disputed, come into play. And in that situation, not the courts, but the House of Representatives and the US Senate decide which of the certifications for electoral college they're going to accept. And basically, if a state has given one certification by December 8th this year, that falls within the safe harbor and that certification gets accepted. But we're looking at states where you could see two certifications, two competing certifications, where maybe a state legislature and the governor disagree as to who wins, and they both send in certifications. In that situation, the Electoral Count Act says the governor is supposed to determine, but if you have partisan Senate, partisan Republican or partisan Democrat, they could decide we like this one, we don't like that one, we're going to pick this one. And the way the 12th Amendment works and the way the Electoral Count Act works, the Senate gets to decide, but then the House has to agree with them. And the House caucuses separately if there's a disagreement about who's won. And you can have a situation where the House and the Senate don't agree. And in that situation, you can wind up with the whole thing under the 12th Amendment being sent to the House of Representatives, where Ohio gets one vote, and Washington, D.C. probably gets one vote because they've got 3 electoral college votes, and Texas gets one vote, New York gets one vote, and Iowa gets one vote, and Idaho gets one vote, and Alaska and Hawaii. And in that situation, it depends on the partisan makeup of each of the state delegations. So you could have a situation where either President Trump or Joe Biden won a massive popular vote, where they might have won a massive electoral college vote if the electoral college votes were all counted, but there's a dispute between the House and the Senate, and it gets sent over to the House for voting state by state. If that process doesn't produce a result, and if Nancy Pelosi is Speaker of the House and she doesn't like the way it's going, she's got a variety of tools to stop that. You could wind up in a situation where no one is certified as president or as vice president, and in that case, the Speaker of the House could become acting president. So we don't want to go there for any of those nightmare scenarios, which is why I keep coming back to this basic principle. Everybody needs to have the ability to vote. Those votes all need to be counted. And people need to agree on that count, and then those votes need to be certified according to the procedure set in the state. And the minimum amount of litigation over that, the better. And the more that civic groups can enunciate those principles as fundamental, the better off we are, because that allows us to really reduce the risk of nightmare scenario. Last thing I want to talk about before giving over the floor is voter intimidation, voter suppression, the things people have been worrying about with preventing the use of drop boxes or the mail is not working, or fighting over voting on election day once early voting is over. And the short answer is there are voter hotlines that have been set up for every state that are nonpartisan. They're easy to access by the web. And this is a case where if you see something, report it, and the process can help it work out. And every voter should know that if they think they're being intimidated or somebody else is being intimidated, absolutely anywhere, they go directly to the election official locally and say, this is what's happening, there's intimidation going on. And that election official has got the absolute duty to try and figure it out and solve it. And at the same time, they can call that hotline. So that's something you can do at the local level to help make things better. And I'm going to stop right there and listen to everybody else about the situation in Ohio. If I can talk about it further from a Washington perspective, glad to do it. This is the work of Keep Our Republic. Last thing, a pitch for a podcast series we're doing on all these issues. It's called Unconventional Threat. It's looking at all the risks of this election, presidential use of emergency powers, voter intimidation, all of foreign interference, all the things that can go wrong, and focusing on what the solutions may be. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next, what we're going to do is switch over to Dr. Staci Rhine. She's a professor in the Department of Political Science at Wittenberg University. Her research interests involve studying the media's effect on political knowledge and participation. And in the meantime, I will still continue to encourage you to drop your questions in the chat as each person is speaking. So, Dr. Rhine, over to you.
Thank you, and thanks for inviting me today. I'm going to step back a little bit and talk about how political scientists look at elections, and how also it's always good to remind people who are really interested in elections that they're not representative of the public. So political scientists, when they first started studying elections, they expected to find this great individuals who study issues and vote based on that, and they were kind of surprised not to find that. And one of the theories that we've ended up being more confident with is something we called retrospective voting. So when there's peace and prosperity, we return the incumbents to power. When it's not, we throw the rascals out. And so it doesn't mean that the incumbents control those things, but they are punished or rewarded based on that environment. So for example, when George H.W. Bush was in his last year of office in 2008, the Iraq War and the Afghanistan conflict were still going on. The beginning of the Great Recession was happening. and his approval levels were in the 20s. And that's sort of that reaction to that environment. And so, but one thing that has muddled this understanding of reward or punish of peace and prosperity is polarization, which no doubt you've heard a lot about. And it's a polarization that's not necessarily based on issues, but it is an affective polarization or a negative polarization. So it's not, well, this party wants this issue and I want the other one. It's, I hate the other party. And so because I hate the other party, I will stick with my own party. And what that polarization has done over decades is it shaped the contours of elections. So we haven't had a landslide presidential election since 1984, Reagan's re-election. Another example of polarization in 2018, 2 representatives were indicted right before the election, Chris Collins of New York, Duncan Hunter of California, and their voters re-elected them because the other side's worse. And so I need to return that incumbent. And so this polarization also helps to explain, so given the normal standards of peace and prosperity, President Trump should have much lower approval, but instead his approval is still in the low 40s. And that's polarization sort of constraining that variation that we would normally see. So I want to talk a little bit about what 2018 tells us about 2020, and then I'll briefly end with some comments on the media. So 2018 is in this context of polarization. So polarization on steroids even in 2018. And it's also one of the things that's happened with polarization is incumbents are less. 20, 30 years ago, incumbents could win re-election on their own reputations. But in this era of polarization, voters are increasingly voting the same party throughout. And so there's less split ticket voting and there's less ability for incumbents to insulate from them larger factors. In 2018, on the Democratic side, the challengers raised extraordinary amounts of money, often more than incumbents, which is really unusual. In the past, when incumbents are beaten, the challengers have raised money, but usually not as much. And as you may also recall, turnout was 53% for a midterm election, which is extraordinary. And those also help set up 2020. So we're seeing those same patterns. And it also explains why Republican office holders have been hesitant to break with President Trump. Because of polarization, because people are likely to vote down ballot on the same ticket, it's more difficult to break from him. In the past, 20, 30 years ago, you might be able to create distance to create your own reputation if a president is struggling, for example, in your state or nationally. We're also seeing that same pattern of fundraising this year. I assume you've seen these extraordinary numbers of dollars that Senate challengers have raised. And what's also interesting, like 2018, you have candidates who have not held office before raising really large sums of money. Also, like 2018, a lot of women running, probably because of the Trump era. So you see a lot of parallels with 2018 that we see again in 2020. But it also suggests that we need to keep in mind that polarization and that power. As Republican states have appeared more competitive, we'll see. I mean, we don't know, but remember that polarization is really powerful. But it does suggest that if it is broached, that those down ticket ballots seats may also shift also. And given this is the beginning of another decade in redistricting, the election results are really important. Okay, so briefly, Adam Todd asked me to also talk about the media. And an obvious question when you're talking about polarization is it because of media or media usage? What explains these patterns? And so there's one stream of literature that talks about we exist in echo chambers and we read or watch media that confirms what we know and reinforces those positions. And there's some evidence that for some perhaps really attentive people, But back to, most people don't pay attention to politics. Most people aren't caught in echo chambers. A lot of people get their news from local news. And so whether the news is the explanation for that, it's not clear. Social media, we don't have a great understanding of that. We do know on social media, people are more likely to interact with like-minded individuals, but it's obvious, for obvious reasons, it's much harder to study what people are using on the individual level. Social media this year, was just referenced, is the companies are trying to do better after the 2016 difficulties. They were hacked and they were manipulated. Twitter took down some fake accounts a few weeks ago. Facebook has removed a troll farm in Arizona, but it's still hard to make. It's hard until in retrospect to see what we know. Twitter agreed not to take political ads this year to try to head off that problem. Facebook did, and Facebook is also running ads that they're not fact checking. So and we can't see those from the outside. So when you run an ad on television, we can say, oh, that's not true, and they might get unfavorable coverage, but we can't see those ads on social media. So it's harder for us from the outside to assess what's happening on social media and what role that might play. And so hindsight's 2020 there, but the companies do feel pressure to have more control over it. I'm just not sure how much ability they do in that. And I'd love to talk some more about social media manipulation if we have time later. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rhine. Next, we have Attorney Paul Moke. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Attorney Paul Moke, he's an adjunct professor of law at our University of Dayton. His civil litigation experience includes works in the fields of voting rights and bankruptcy, probate, and personal injury law. So I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mally. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and to address the group this evening. I'd like to start by talking about election-related litigation nationwide and here in Ohio. There were over 350 cases nationwide involving election-related litigation in the 2020 election cycle. And most of this litigation has concerned the impact of COVID on the voting process. The issues concern voting by mail, drop boxes, postal delays, and election day deadlines, among other things. The general trend is that the trial courts have issued decisions that are favorable to civil rights plaintiffs and the Democratic Party, but that the appellate courts have stepped in, issuing stays or decisions reversing the trial court. Here in Ohio, as Senator Brown mentioned earlier, we had litigation in the Northern District in a case A. Philip Randolph Institute versus LaRose, involving the number of drop boxes allowed in each county. The district judge issued a decision prohibiting Secretary of State LaRose from limiting the number of those drop boxes to one per county. But then just a couple of weeks ago, the Sixth Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals panel issued a stay. Similarly, in Florida, in the felony disenfranchisement case, which is Jones versus DeSantis, the issue involved the restoration of ex-felon voting rights, and the state legislature had passed new legislation indicating that an ex-felon could not vote until all court-related fines and fees were paid. That new statute got challenged, and the lower court struck that down as a violation of several constitutional rights. But then in September, the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals reversed that decision on appeal. So a similar trend is going on across the country, whether we look at Texas or Alabama or Wisconsin. And this pattern reflects the impact of a growing number of conservative Trump appointees into the federal appellate courts. That said, there are a handful of countervailing decisions, and I want to sort of shine the spotlight for a second on one very recent decision that I think is illuminating for several reasons. That is a decision coming out of Pennsylvania, the Scarnati versus Bookvar case. And that issue, the issue in that case concerned the extension of the deadline of receipt of mailed-in ballots for a period of 3 days following Election Day. And so this case is important not only because Pennsylvania is a swing state, but also because the case ended up in the US Supreme Court. It provides a window into the framework that a new conservative majority on the court may use in voting rights cases. So in the Pennsylvania portion of the case, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court decided in favor of the plaintiffs on this issue to extend the deadline for receipt of a mailed-in ballot. If it had been postmarked on Election Day, there would be a 3-day period within which the local board of election could receive that ballot. And the court grounded its decision in 2 state election laws, one coming out of the state constitution that expressly requires the, quote, free and equal election in the state. And second, the election code, which in the state said that any ambiguity in voting procedure should be construed in favor of enfranchising voters and not disenfranchising them. And the court noted the precedent of natural disasters like floods in the previous cases in the state, where state courts had extended election deadlines and procedures in the face of natural disasters, and reasoned that COVID, in conjunction with the problems in the US Post Office, warranted this extension of the deadline. But following that decision, the Republicans applied for a stay in the US Supreme Court, and their argument in a nutshell involved usurpation on the part of the state Supreme Court in the power of the state legislature arising out of the US Constitution provision on elections, which is in Article 1, Section 5 of the US Constitution, which gives the state legislature the power to determine the, quote, time, place, and manner of the election process. That argument that the Republican Party made on appeal mirrors the position that 3 members of the Bush versus Gore majority took back in 2000. And several days ago, the US Supreme Court rejected that argument by a 4-4 split vote. The 4 most conservative justices on the court would have granted the stay, but Chief Justice Roberts joined the 3 more liberal justices in opposing that position. So it was a 4-4 split, which had the effect of upholding what the state Supreme Court had done. Query, what difference would it make if a newly appointed Justice Barrett were there? The case illustrates, I think, the fundamental truth that much of state law determines the scope of voting rights. And if this usurpation argument gets majority support on the US Supreme Court, that provision of the Constitution can get used as a sword to strike down election laws at the state level that the court majority disagrees with. The importance of state law becomes even more critical when we look at issues like partisan gerrymandering. And recently, the Roberts Court decided that partisan gerrymandering in federal courts raises a political question that's non-justiciable, meaning that the federal courts are not going to have jurisdiction over those cases, which in turn means that any partisan gerrymandering challenge is going to have to get brought under state law. Here in Ohio, we have some of the most extremely gerrymandered congressional districts in the country. In Cincinnati and Hamilton County, we see that. In Cleveland and Toledo, we see that. In Akron, we see that. It's a deep problem. And it likewise affects the nature of the state delegation in the process that Jonathan was referencing earlier. We have 2 seats on the Ohio Supreme Court that are up for election this year. And although there are many issues that one might consider in determining who to support, this is certainly one worthy of consideration. Finally, I just want to say a brief word about why all this struggle and discord over voting rights is happening. I want to emphasize a recent book by Stephen Levitsky from Harvard entitled How Democracies Die, which is a comparative study of different democracies around the world that tumbled into authoritarianism and tries to abstract certain themes. And, just to kind of reduce the thesis down, the argument is that among the factors of importance are demographic changes, economic changes that certain groups perceive threats as far as changes in the nature of the population of a country, changes in the distribution of the wealth in the country, cultural threats. And a lot of this applies to the United States right now as we look at growing levels of diversity, growing levels of political inequality, threats coming out of automation and losses of jobs. And you couple that with, religious and ethical conflict, and the situation is ripe for conflict. And the temptation is for political parties to go dirty, to play hardball with one another in this fight. And I think it's pretty clear that that's what's going on in America. And I fear we're in for yet more of it over the next decade. I'm hoping that cooler minds prevail. And that's one of the reasons why I applaud the university for doing this panel tonight, because I think these are really important issues for us and for the future of our democracy. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have attorney Ellis Jacobs, who is an attorney with the Advocates for Basic Legal Equality. It's a nonprofit law firm that provides legal assistance in civil matters to help eligible low-income individuals and groups in Western Ohio achieve equal justice and economic opportunity. So, Attorney Jacobs, I turn it to you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you. Thanks for the introduction. In addition to doing a variety of legal work at ABLE, I also, since 2004, have been coordinating the Miami Valley Voter Protection Coalition, which is a group of, it's a nonpartisan group, and it's affiliated with a statewide organization called the Ohio Voting Rights Coalition, which is affiliated with Election Protection, a national coalition of nonpartisan groups that are concerned about protecting the right to vote. And so I've been trying to work on this issue at a very local level since 2004. And it's been interesting. And I guess the story that I want to tell you is about the fact that there is important work for people to do at the local level to protect the right to vote in the context of these sorts of groups. What we do is, starting 6 months before the election, people start going to boards of election meetings and seeing what they're doing and what their plans are for the upcoming election. And we talk to other people around the state, and we try to get a sense of what's going on and what are the concerns and what needs to be tuned up and what needs to be changed in order to do the election right. Because as you get closer to an election, the Secretary of State starts issuing directives about, we're going to do it this way, we're not going to do it that way. And the boards of elections start issuing their own guidance. We're going to do it this way, we're not going to do it this way. They make decisions at public meetings, and all of those decisions matter a lot as far as who's going to get access to voting and how easily those votes are going to be counted. And so we try to keep track of all of that stuff. And in past years, we've worked with the local boards to make sure that they set early voting hours that were very open and accessible. And that was before the state stepped in and said, nope, we're going to have uniform voting hours. And in fact, a couple of board members in Dayton went to the mat over that issue. No, we're going to have more early voting hours, and they were ousted. People may remember that. I think it was 2012. And that came out of the work of this local coalition, first getting the Board of Elections to go out on a limb and give people extra early voting hours. That one didn't work out so well, but other things we've done, I think, do work out. And ultimately, it's all part of the effort to get to the bottom of what's going on. So what is going on? You've heard of people talking about some of the bigger picture issues, the struggle over the number of drop boxes people are going to have. You heard Senator Brown say that we have counties with 1 million people. We have counties with a little over 10,000 people, and they all get one drop box. A drop box is an important convenience in an era where people wonder about how timely the mail will be delivered. So there's been litigation over that, and right now it hasn't turned out so great. And so we're stuck with the one drop box. Here are some things we've noticed. That one Dropbox rule, we're seeing this already around the state, is creating some long lines of cars backing up for people trying to drop their ballots in that Dropbox. So what does a coalition like ours do in a situation like that? Well, we go to the Board of Elections and say, come on, guys, you got to solve this problem. You've got to figure out a better traffic flow. You got to figure out that you're going to put people out there to grab envelopes out of people's hands, and so as long as they can see what you're doing, and get them into the box so that they're not backed up onto the highway as they have been in Cincinnati. So that's one thing that people have spotted and worked on to try to solve before it becomes even a bigger problem as more and more people start wanting to vote early. In Greene County, Ohio, which happens to be where I live, it's where Xenia, Yellow Springs, Fairborn are, right outside of Dayton. There have been really long lines of people wanting to vote in person. And so we noticed that. We talked to the Board of Elections director, the board members, and try to encourage them to come up with some flow patterns that will be more conducive and reduce the length of those lines. People shouldn't have to stand in line for 2.5 hours on a Monday afternoon in order to cast an in-person early ballot. Here's some other things we're noticing and here's really my biggest concern. People had a right to request, and still do have a right to request, to be mailed a absentee ballot. You have to fill out a form. It's got to have certain elements on that form. When the Board of Election receives them, if you've done everything right, they mail you the ballot. If you've done some things wrong, they have the obligation to get in touch with you to tell you what you've done wrong, so you can correct it in time to get your absentee ballot. Most of the boards of elections have a backlog of those things that they have either not tried to get cured or have not been able to yet get cured. And so that creates an interesting situation. And it's something that we're trying to learn more about to figure out, to what extent we've got a problem and what can be done to solve that. Another problem we're starting to see emerge is similar, but this is where people have actually returned their ballots. They got the ballot, they requested it, they got it. They've returned it either in the mail or in a drop box. And before they can open your actual ballot envelope, they look at the outside of that envelope, and it's got to have all the right information on it to show you are who you are and that you're the registered voter. And if it's missing something, a couple of critical elements, they don't open it up. But again, they are legally obliged to get in touch with you to give you an opportunity to cure it. But they are so backed up with all of the mail-in ballots and drop-off ballots that they're getting that they're kind of slow in validating the envelopes and slow in getting back to voters. You only have 7 days after the election to get these things cured. Are they going to be able to do that in time so that everybody has a right to have their ballots opened and counted? You can see how these sorts of problems can set up litigation after the election. Do we need to extend the time because you didn't send out these notices in time, etc.? We do not hope to go there. The goal of our local coalitions is to jump on these problems early in the game and see if we can do some things to encourage the boards of elections to do better and solve these problems before they generate some extensive litigation that will, keep lawyers busy, but not really serve democracy all that well. So I'm happy to take questions. It's been a terrific panel, and that's what I've got. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I think we're going to move over to questions. And we have a first question coming in really directed towards Jonathan Weiner, but given each person's words spoken along the way, we could start with you answering and then go on down the panel. And that question is there any expectation of nightmare scenarios in this 2020?
Yeah, there's grave risk of them. And it's from both domestic and foreign threats. The domestic threat is that somebody will try and stage an incident somewhere in order to shut down voting or challenge legitimate votes. The foreign one is that the foreign entity will come in, cast some fraudulent votes that are detected, which then are used to call into question the validity of real votes and again stop the counting. So the nightmare scenarios that we were worried about in the first instance are anything that prevent people from voting, anything that then stops the count, and then the kind of litigation that Paul talked about, for example, where you have judges taking first one position and then another in terms of the interplay of state and federal law, which causes the whole thing to freeze up and then doesn't have a single, genuine, publicly accepted, public confidence is strong in certification that allows a state's voters to be heard and registered as this is the presidential choice we have made in this state, and this is what the Senate's going to get. So it's all those variations of that threat that I worry about, which is why I go back to the basic principles. Everybody should be able to vote, have the vote counted, and have that count certified with minimum fuss. Anything that interferes with that, we ought to be opposing. Anything that supports that, we ought to be supporting. Regardless of who you support for president, and then that gets in turn to this issue of how do you maintain public confidence in our government and public trust long term. And all of the foreign interference is about undermining that. It's not really only about who they prefer. That may be part of it, but it's about undermining confidence in ourselves and our own system. So I'd also ask the question about whether partisan judges are a problem. My own view is whatever we can do that's not partisan is good, because we are one country. We've got to be United States of America, and the messaging on that and the things that can build public trust in one another, even when we have strong differences of opinion, is really important going ahead as a country. Thank you.
Dr. Rhine, do you have anything to add to that?
Everything he said. He got it.
And Paul or Ellis, anything to add?
Staci said it very well.
And that here.
So,
This is Sherrod Brown. Could I weigh in on what that? I won't do this on every question, but could I say one word about that?
absolutely.
I think, and I appreciate the Attorney Weiner's perspective, and I think he understands these issues better than probably anybody I've listened to, but I think it's important that we're not alarmists leading into election day. I'm not saying he was. I just think it's important that, one of the candidates for president has said consistently that mail-in balloting is fraudulent, that mail-in absentees are really the same thing. And Bob Taft and I were talking about this week, a Republican Secretary of State for 8 years after I've been Secretary of State as a Democrat for 8 years. And we both agree strongly that mail-in voting in Ohio is safe for the voter, of course, but safe in terms of being counted and is reliable and there's never been any fraud problems. And in the same with, we've heard the president encourage a bit some violent people maybe go to the polls. And I just think all of us have to be really careful not to play into that and make people fearful, because that's what I don't mean to make this partisan, but that's what the president wants to do. He wants people, particularly people of color, to approach the idea of voting with some fear, maybe to keep some of them away. And I just think it's really important that we always remember that as we talk about elections, if I could. And I promise I won't weigh in again because it's the panelist.
I want to follow up on that. It's very important. Every state, in addition to federal law, has got laws against voter intimidation.
Right.
There's a whole bunch of formal things. There's like 8 kinds of voter intimidation. You can go online and get all 8 that are pretty well defined and known. You see it, you report it to the national hotline, you report it to your local election official, and everybody absolutely should feel safe.
And it's a felony everywhere, isn't it? Always a felony.
It's a felony everywhere.
As it should be.
So this is something the country wants to see people be able to do. The country wants people to be able to vote. There may be moments when individual politicians will put barriers in the way, but our system has worked with this through war and through peace, through every kind of civic trouble, through past pandemics. And people should feel good about voting, and they should do it. And our job is to help make people feel safe, comfortable, and to know there's recourse if anything gets messed up.
Exactly right. Thank you.
And let me just add that the hotline that people are talking about is 1-866-OUR-VOTE, and it is staffed by this nonpartisan election protection coalition, the League of Women Voters, Common Cause, a lot of groups that have been around a long time, and they'll have experts. They can answer the people's questions and make sure that problems get solved.
Thank you. I actually have a follow-up question, and I'll go back to the chat in just one second, but I wanted to, I'm curious. So we have one party that has boasted that the current president is not political, is not a politician, and that the fact that he's not a politician gets things done. However, what I hear right now is a lot of speak about the threat of the loss of democracy as it stands. How much of that do you think, how much of that line of thought that we don't have a politician per se in office is impacting this certain, I guess, decrease in the value of what we have as a democracy, as a republic?
So what you see around the world are people who claim to be populists, and they run against the system. And part of their power is to delegitimize the system. You need to bring in me as the outsider, as the populist. And this is not unique to the United States. And so part of their power is to criticize and undermine existing power. And so that's the source of power. And it's going on all around the world. So I think they're related.
I guess I would add to that a focus on the history of voting in America. And some of the issues we're seeing now are not new to our republic. The broad question of who is a worthy voter goes back several centuries. And if you look at that history, the role of social movements, first in the form of the suffragette movement, and secondly, the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s, transformed that whole debate. And so I think that's another factor in the public expectations of the importance of voting rights now. And so that's part of the context too.
We have a 15th Amendment and we have a 19th Amendment to the Constitution, both of which had to be passed to guarantee the people the right to vote who didn't have it before. But now everybody's got it, and nothing is really to be permitted to get in the way of it. And when it does short term, it needs to be fixed. And I believe in early voting. I believe in mail drops. I believe in the post office. I believe in voting in person, whatever lets the public participate. The higher the levels of participation we have, the better off we are as a society. I've done work all over the world as a diplomat. When countries fall apart, it's because people have lost faith in their political system. And you then get into tribalism. You can get actually into civil conflict. All kinds of bad things happen. And you also tend to get demagogues winding up as dictators when that process continues to go to its logical end. The rise of populist demagogues throughout the world in the current period is very disturbing, and we've seen under many different political systems. It's not happening in just one place. Russia, China, Brazil, the Philippines, Slovakia, Hungary, Austria, actually. Just for starters that come to mind immediately, I know I've missed a bunch, but it's a very disturbing phenomenon, and it can be reclaimed best through voter participation in governments that work for the people, where people feel close to the government. The closer we can make local governments work for the people and people feel connected to their governments locally, the better off we are nationally. So what happens at the state level and at the local level matters too, enormously, in terms of how people feel about the government.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to add to that, or? Okay, great. So we have another question. Why are the decisions or the election issues reviewed by the courts being highlighted throughout I'm going to assume throughout the different times each of you spoke? Why are they not considered political questions like gerrymandering?
I guess I can take an initial stab at that, and then Ellis can revise my remarks as necessary. I think part of the answer to that concerns the legal test for what is a political question. And without doing a whole dissertation on it, I mean, basically, is the case involving an issue that's textually committed to a different branch of the government besides the judiciary? Or second, are there problems with, quote, judicially manageable standards, unquote, during the review and resolution of the case? And so a lot of the issues that we're talking about involve interpretations of statutes or constitutional provisions that are like well within the ken of the process of judicial review. But gerrymandering is a complex question, both in terms of its methodology and in terms of what I would argue is the lack of training on the part of our judges in the world of statistics and advanced math that's needed to sort of understand and test for what is a gerrymandered district. And, you know, you can kind of just look at a map, and when the district boundaries look weird, like they do in Cleveland and Toledo and Akron, that's one test. But then when you get into Monte Carlo statistics and, you know, supercomputers to figure out where the different lines could have been drawn and what's a statistical outlier and what isn't, The methodology makes many justices, including our chief justices, eyes glaze over and they don't really understand what the experts are talking about and they just punt. And that's exactly what happened in Rucho. So that's where we are. I speak as someone who was involved somewhat in the legal team in the Ohio case 2 years ago.
That was a great answer, Paul. I mean, all I would add is that most of these issues do tend to be textual. They're related to statutes and they're, amenable to resolution by courts if the courts are willing to step up and perform their role. We'll see how it goes this time around. There will be cases.
I'd like to highlight one area which is going to be really important to watch, which is the question of whether the Supreme Court or other courts are going to get involved in 12th Amendment or electoral count act if it gets to that. If there's any uncertainty over the Electoral College result, because the Constitution clearly contemplates that the House and the Senate decide those things, not the courts. But courts like to get involved sometimes, and it will be fascinating to see the interplay. One possibility is that the Electoral Count Act, which is only a statute, it's only a law, could be seen as not consistent with the 12th Amendment, which is less specific. And if that happens, we're really in a no man's land, or no person's land. So I'm hopeful that if we get into that crazy scenario involving the Electoral Count Act and the 12th Amendment, that the courts do stay out of it, because I think that would complicate an already very nightmarish scenario, which would be decided on partisan terms one way or another, and very, very dicey for the country. I hope we never get there, but if we do, having the court involved could make it even worse.
Thank you. Speaking of the prediction that there will be litigation, there will be problems, there will be issues. In 2016, of course, the decision was made by the Electoral College rather than the popular vote. How much do you think that might influence, and this particular election might influence us to do away with or reconsider the Electoral College?
Requires a constitutional amendment.
Yeah.
That's a lot of work. You'd have to have tremendous consensus in a whole lot of states that it was time to do it. The less expensive way of doing it is with this national compact, which would get there more quickly, which is the way people are trying to do it. It just requires more states to get in. Hard, but not impossible.
Were you going to say something, Attorney Jacobs? Okay. Another question is, is there a high chance, or how the polls are indicating right now that Biden is ahead? Do you think there is a chance at this close to the actual election that could be wrong? So the prediction of his lead.
So polls are just a sample of what are people thinking today, and it's an art form. Who's going to show up and vote? So let's say you weight it so that 54% of the electorate is women, but only 44% are able to show up because they're overwhelmed with childcare or work and they can't get away. So it's an estimate. Who do we think will vote? And if young people voted half the amount that our model put in, that will change the estimate. So it's always who will actually vote. And even if you love looking at polls, you'll see the dots are everywhere. So reaching people, just, trying to figure out, is this representative of the population? Have we underestimated who's going to vote? It's an art form, and it really depends on who actually votes, not what the polls are.
Another question is, if there is a blue wave what is expected as actions the president and Congress will take in the lame duck session?
If there's a blue wave, I don't think that there would be very much. The president would continue to issue regulations in his last weeks to repeal Obama era previous regulations, which in turn a Biden administration would be likely to reverse. And the president would clearly want to address some of his other issues associated with things like litigation risk in the private sector. So I think you could see a lot of executive branch actions out of the White House that could be potentially unpredictable. I think you would see essentially no activity by Congress if there was a clear result very quickly. What we saw when President Obama became president is that the major piece of economic stimulus legislation that was enacted almost immediately after he became president was all drafted during the November-December period. It was essentially done by the first week of January and then just codified from there, but all the ideas came then. So we would see a lot of energy by the incoming and not very much by the outgoing, except within the White House to complete this process of trying to change laws, which would almost certainly get reversed quickly. But this president operates in a way that's very often impulsive and difficult to predict ahead of time. One can predict that he's going to look to extinguish liability in every way he can. And then there's the question about whether there's the opportunity to get additional judges in at any level, which Senator McConnell has been intent on for the past 30 years and has had tremendous success on now for quite a long time. So I could imagine that. But I don't think that's where the action would be fundamentally. It would be whatever the White House did. And whether that was quiet or chaos inducing. My own view is that chaos is not the friend of the American public. It's not the friend of economic recovery. It's not the friend of COVID recovery. And so as much steadiness as the rest of us can do in the event that there's not steadiness at the top, that senators can help bring to bear, and congressmen and governors, regardless of party, that's going to be important. The business community throughout the country can also be incredibly helpful by having a consensus approach towards the transition. And ordinary Americans can have a tremendous impact by being kind to one another and trying to support opportunities to find common ground. The countries that wind up succeeding are countries that find common ground rather than division amongst people. And there's an awful lot we can agree on when it comes to defeating COVID. We're going to need to. And people who choose to get in the way of all of that by taking extreme positions or fomenting disruption, that needs to be combated gently and firmly at the same time in order to create the civic space for the vast range of non-extremist behavior to take place safely to allow the country to move forward. We've got to continue to innovate in terms of people's access to the internet so that this kind of thing that we're doing today is something that everybody can participate in. We have to find ways to get kids educated through this thing if schools can't be open in person. So there's a lot of practical things we're going to have to do to respond to COVID, continue to respond to COVID and keep people going, regardless of what's happening at the top. And this can and must be done at the state level, even if there's a nightmare in where I'm living these days in Washington, which could happen after the elections. So I rely on the good sense of the people, the public servants, the academics, the civil society, the business communities of Ohio to keep Ohio together through all conditions. The closer people are to the problems, the better the position they are potentially to solve them.
One other thought I would add to that excellent statement, Jonathan, and I guess I'm thinking of the image of a three-ring circus as we look at the next 2 months. And certainly, excuse me, the center ring is what's happening with the presidential election. But one of the side rings of our circus involves issues over the census and redistricting, And so among the cases that are pending before the Supreme Court for oral argument between now and the end of the calendar year is a case, New York versus Trump, in which the question is whether President Trump has the authority to direct the Census Bureau to, in its statistics and census data, deduct out estimates for illegal residents in the United States. And that's a constitutional question because it concerns sort of the interpretation of a clause in the Constitution that references persons, not legal citizens in the census. And it's I think another example of what Litsky, the How Democracies Die author, talks about, which is the reliance on crutches, quote unquote, in political battles, so that instead of trying to go head to head in the electoral process on the merits of ideas or policies, there's this effort to gerrymander or rig the electoral process in favor of a political party, using power to do that. And so not only do we have to be mindful of the current presidential election, but in the coming 2 years, we have to really pay attention to what's going on with redistricting and some of these broader issues.
Since Paul mentioned redistricting, let me just add that in Ohio, we've actually changed the way we're going to do redistricting in this based upon the new census numbers. Up until recently, whatever party dominated the state house and the statewide offices could do basically whatever they wanted, both for congressional districts and for state house districts. And that's changed. While the new plans or the new rules aren't great, they do give the minority party some say in how that gets done. And it'll be interesting to see how this plays out based on the new numbers.
Thank you for that. We do have one closeout or kind of closeout question. And if you saw some questions that you could answer in final remarks, please feel free to do that. One person asks, do you think making Election Day a national holiday would help voter, I assume that means voter turnout, to move
Yes.
those?
Yeah, making it a holiday. Many countries either have it on a weekend or a holiday. You're not competing with work. You're not competing with school. It absolutely would increase turnout.
And I see one asking, what kind of classes should you take in law school if you want to do this kind of work? Take any of the classes Paul is teaching. And what else would you recommend, Paul?
Well, I thank you for that compliment, Ellis. I will return it. I think they should take your class. I guess my sense is that a lot of the law that we're talking about here and the politics we're talking about here involves statistics. And often at American universities, you have one part of the campus taking math and statistics and another part taking law and history, and the two don't mix. And I strongly feel that this is an area of weakness in the structure of American law schools, that they need to focus not only on statistics as it relates to voting, but many aspects of litigation, from environmental law to engineering to torts. This comes up increasingly in courts, and lawyers are kind of flat-footed, I think, to the extent that they don't understand statistics better.
My two final thoughts. One of the best courses I took in law school was a course I took outside the law school. It was called Statistics. And I've used it ever since. I no longer do regression analysis myself by hand, but I have used it in the decades since. It's made a difference in how I understand the world. I advise every law student, if you have a chance, take a statistics course if you haven't done it already. Last thought, other than that, if you're interested in the stuff we're talking about today, take a course in regulatory law. It doesn't matter which type of admin or regulatory law you take a course in. Once you understand the structure of how to analyze and work with with regulations and get involved in notice and comment and see how it works in how regulations interpret law, it's a whole wide set of practice areas to follow, not only what your clients may be interested in, but what you're interested in, even potentially your dreams and your ability to further shape the world. Go do it, have fun, engage.
Well, thank all of you. Thank you to our panelists, and thank you for those of us attending who are engaged with the panelists. Next, I'd like to turn it over to Silas Augsburger and Connor Dowd, presidents of our Republican and Democratic Law Societies at University of Dayton School of Law. Over to you all. Silas, you're muted.
Thanks. Good evening, and thanks for the opportunity to speak to you all tonight. I'm Silas, and I'm the president for the UDSL Republican Law Society. You know, like most everybody, I enjoy a good election night victory, and I'm optimistic that November 3rd will be a good night for Republicans. But more important than a victory, and I think I can say this for Connor as well, is that this election is a good, fair, and competitive process. You know, as Abraham Lincoln once famously remarked, a house divided against itself cannot stand. And that was true in 1860, and it's true for us today. You know, I've got a lot of friends who are Republicans and a lot of friends who are Democrats. And my Democratic friends and I, some of us have a lot of big political differences between us. But at the end of the day, I know, and I think that my Democratic friends know, that we all want what's best for the United States, our United States of America. You know, a good rivalry, it's fun, healthy even, but rather than allowing our differences to polarize us, we should use our disagreements to foster productive dialogues and build relationships. You know, in fact, a few moments ago, Connor and I were actually just debating the arguments for or against, you know, amending the Electoral College. But those are good conversations for us to have, and they strengthen friendships. I know Connor and I have enjoyed you know, the opportunity to co-sponsor a few events between our clubs on campus, and we look forward to doing that more in the future. It just adds, you know, adds meaningful conversation, and we appreciate that. But I'd like to reiterate what a number of the panelists tonight have said, and that's please vote. You know, we have a unique set of rights and liberties as Americans, one of which is voting. And I don't care if you're a Republican or Democrat or Libertarian or something else. This is an amazing opportunity to participate directly in the governance of our nation, our state, our county, your city, you know, whatever, every level of government. So let's celebrate our freedoms, you know, celebrate our rights to disagree by voting. And then let's celebrate together, regardless of who wins on November 3rd. You know, celebrate good races run, and let's work toward a better tomorrow together.
Yeah, that's great, Silas. And well, I'm glad to hear you're feeling optimistic about the election, because I think I feel just as optimistic, although I felt that way in 2016. And as the president of the College Democrats, it wasn't quite right then. Hi, everyone. My name is Connor Dowd. Again, I'm the president of the University of Dayton School of Law College Democrats, not the undergrad, just to make that clear. And Sam, I just wanted to share with Silas, I think that really this year at UD, now the pandemic has hindered everything, but we really try, we talk, I think, and hear a lot about the idea of civility. And that's something that Silas and I have talked and really tried to actively see where can we come together. So whether it's hosting events together or some kind of program on campus whenever we're allowed back on campus, and finding a place where we can have those discussions. I think often it can be really challenging if we get in our own little bubble. Personally, for example, while I identify as a Democrat, I went to the Catholic University of America, which was quite conservative for undergrad. And I really love that experience. And I think that really formed me as a person. It made me a better debater, better able to understand why I believe what I believe. So I really do believe in the idea of civility and having conversations with people across the aisle. And now the college Dems this year, what we've really focused on, because it is election, while we're trying to have speakers, and I was so excited to see Senator Sherrod Brown, one of my personal heroes and favorite politicians. So thank you again, Senator Brown, for joining us. What we really focused on is some of what you heard about tonight, which was engaging with voters. So most of our programming has focused on connecting our students with resources out in the community. So finding those poll workers, finding students to be poll watchers, as well as students who are going to work those hotlines we talked about. So having opportunities to work on the hotline and help people just access their vote. And that really is what is important to us. And so that really is our belief as the College Dems. Well, we definitely have a political belief, and there's a party we support and candidates we support. Our hope is that we can do it while growing as individuals by working with groups like the College Republicans that we feel confident and fully understand our own views. So thank you so much to everyone for coming tonight. This was an excellent event.
Thank you to you both. So that is going to conclude our session today. Just a reminder that there is a closing keynote event on Monday, October 26th from 5 to 6 p.m. with former Mayor of South Bend, Indiana, Pete Buttigieg, with introductions from Dayton's Mayor, Nan Whaley. I would like to add my encouragement. Please vote. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you. Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.